Right now, as you watch this video, your coffee mug exists in every possible position on your desk simultaneously. The particles in your brain are exploring countless quantum states at once. Your entire reality should be a chaotic blur of infinite possibilities overlapping and interfering with each other. Yet here you are experiencing one solid, definite world where your coffee stays exactly where you left it. This is quantum mechanics. It reveals something absolutely mind-bending about the nature of reality itself. Every quantum particle exists in what physicists call a superposition. It experiences all possible states until something forces it to choose just one. But here's the part that will make your head spin. According to the math, these quantum possibilities don't just disappear, they split off into parallel worlds where every other outcome plays out simultaneously. So why don't we see these parallel universes? Why doesn't your reality constantly collide with versions where you made different choices, where history unfolded differently, where the laws of physics work in completely alien ways? The answer lies in one of the most elegant and terrifying concepts in modern physics, quantum decoherence theory. Before we dive into the physics that keeps parallel worlds hidden, smash that like button and subscribe. What I'm about to show you will completely change how you see reality. We're going to explore why the quantum multiverse remains invisible. We will explore how your consciousness navigates infinite possibilities, and we will explore what happens when quantum possibilities collapse into the single reality you experience. Prepare yourself for a journey into the quantum realm where nothing is what it seems. Everything is far stranger than you could possibly imagine. Now we begin. Picture this scenario. You're standing at a crossroads, and you need to decide whether to turn left or right. In our everyday experience, you make a choice, and that's it. One path taken, one path not. But quantum mechanics tells us something absolutely wild is happening. At the moment of decision, reality itself splits. One version of you turns left while another version turns right. Both choices happen. Both realities exist. Both versions of you continue living their lives completely unaware of each other. This is the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. It sounds like pure fantasy until you realize it emerges naturally from the mathematics that govern our universe. The equations don't lie. They predict that every quantum measurement, every random event, every moment of uncertainty creates new branches of reality. We're not talking about one or two alternate timelines. We're talking about an infinite explosion of parallel worlds being created every nanosecond. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. If infinite parallel universes exist, why is your reality so stable? Why don't you suddenly find yourself in a world where gravity works backwards, or where the color blue doesn't exist? Why don't these countless realities interfere with each other in obvious ways? The answer reveals something profound about the nature of existence itself. To understand why parallel worlds remain hidden, we need to explore what happens when quantum systems interact with their environment. And this is where quantum decoherence enters the story, like a cosmic magician performing the ultimate disappearing act. Imagine you have a quantum coin that can exist in a superposition. It spins both heads and tails simultaneously until someone observes it. In the pristine isolation of a perfect laboratory, this quantum coin could theoretically maintain its magical dual state forever. But the moment this coin interacts with the real world, something extraordinary happens. The environment acts like billions of tiny observers. Each one measures different aspects of the coin's quantum state. Consider the air molecules bumping into it and the photons of light bouncing off it. Consider the gravitational pull of the table beneath it. Each of these interactions carries away a tiny piece of information about the coin's quantum state. These environmental interactions don't just disturb the system, they fundamentally transform it. The delicate quantum superposition that allowed the coin to be in multiple states simultaneously gets destroyed almost instantaneously. The coherent quantum waves that represented all possible states become incoherent. They get tangled up with the environment in ways that make them practically impossible to untangle. This is quantum decoherence in action. It's not that the parallel worlds disappear, they're still there mathematically speaking, but they become so entangled with their environments that they can no longer interfere with each other. They cannot interfere in any detectable way. Each branch of reality becomes isolated in its own bubble of decoherent existence. Think of it like this. Imagine you're trying to listen to a specific radio station, but there are thousands of other stations broadcasting simultaneously on nearly identical frequencies. In theory, all those signals exist in the same space at the same time, but your radio can only tune into one coherent signal at a time. The others don't disappear. They become indistinguishable noise that your receiver filters out. Quantum decoherence works similarly. All the parallel realities are broadcasting simultaneously, but environmental interactions force each reality to tune into its own specific frequency. The other worlds become quantum noise that we simply cannot perceive or interact with. But the story gets even stranger when you realize that this process happens incredibly fast. We're not talking about seconds or minutes. Quantum decoherence typically occurs in time frames measured in femtoseconds. That's 1/4,000,000th of a second. To put this in perspective, light travels less than the width of a single atom in a femtosecond. By the time your brain processes any conscious thought about a quantum measurement, decoherence has already isolated your reality. It has isolated your reality from all its parallel siblings trillions upon trillions of times over. This explains why our macroscopic world appears classical and predictable despite being built from quantum components. A single electron can exist in a superposition, spinning in multiple directions simultaneously. But a baseball made of trillions of electrons interacts so extensively with its environment. It interacts with air molecules, light particles, and gravitational fields. Decoherence destroys any quantum weirdness almost instantly. The baseball becomes locked into one specific reality. It is isolated from all the parallel worlds where it might have followed slightly different trajectories. The implications become mind-boggling when you consider what this means for consciousness and observation. Every time you make a measurement or observation, you're not just passively recording what already exists, you're actively participating in the process that splits reality into separate branches. This process then immediately cuts off your access to all but one of those branches. When you flip that quantum coin and observe the result, multiple versions of you see different outcomes. The version of you that sees heads becomes entangled with a reality where the result was heads. The version that sees tails becomes entangled with the tails reality. Decoherence then isolates these branches so completely that neither version of you can ever detect the existence of the other. From your perspective, it seems like only one outcome occurred, but that's because decoherence has locked you into experiencing only one branch of the quantum multiverse. The other versions of you are experiencing their realities with equal validity, but they're forever hidden behind an impenetrable wall of environmental entanglement. This reveals something profound about the relationship between consciousness and reality. You're not just observing the universe, you're constantly selecting which version of the universe you get to experience. Every moment of consciousness represents a choice point where reality branches. Then decoherence immediately seals off all the paths you didn't take. But here's where the theory gets really wild. Decoherence doesn't just affect individual quantum measurement, it operates at every level of reality, from subatomic particles to cosmic structures. The air molecules in the room around you are constantly undergoing quantum interactions that split reality. These interactions split reality into countless branches. The photons hitting your eyes right now are creating new parallel worlds with every impact on your retina. even the quantum fluctuations in empty space are generating infinite universes. These are universes where the fundamental constants of physics take on slightly different values. You exist at the intersection of an incomprehensibly vast web of quantum decoherence events. Every nanosecond reality fractures into more parallel worlds than there are atoms in the observable universe. Each branch contains a version of you living a slightly different experience, and decoherence ensures that none of these versions can ever meet. The mathematics behind this process involves some of the most elegant equations in physics. The Schrödinger equation describes how quantum states evolve over time. The decoherence formalism shows how environmental interactions cause certain elements of the density matrix to decay exponentially. In plain language, this means the quantum connections between parallel worlds disappear. They disappear faster than any physical process can exploit them. Scientists have actually measured decoherence in laboratory settings. Experiments with quantum systems like superconducting qubits or trapped ions show exactly how environmental interactions destroy superposition states. Researchers can even control the rate of decoherence. They do this by manipulating how much a quantum system interacts with its surroundings. Isolate the system better and cool it to near absolute zero, and the quantum weirdness persists longer. Expose it to more environmental noise, and the classical predictable behavior emerges more quickly. These experiments prove that decoherence isn't just a theoretical speculation, it's a measurable physical process that we can observe and quantify. The reason you don't see parallel worlds colliding isn't because they don't exist, it's because the universe has a built-in mechanism that keeps them permanently separated. But this raises an intriguing question. If decoherence isolates parallel realities so completely, how do we know they exist at all? Why should we believe in worlds we can never see or interact with? The answer lies in the consistency and predictive power of quantum mechanics. The mathematical formalism that predicts decoherence is the same formalism that gave us lasers and computer chips. It gave us MRI machines and countless other technologies that define modern life. When a theory makes accurate predictions about the observable world, we tend to trust its implications. We trust its implications about the unobservable world as well. Moreover, the many worlds interpretation solves several deep conceptual puzzles that plague other interpretations. It explains why quantum measurements seem to produce random results. It does so while preserving the deterministic evolution described by the Schrödinger equation. It eliminates the need for a mysterious ad hoc wave function collapse. It shows that collapse is just an illusion created by decoherence. And it provides a framework for understanding quantum mechanics without invoking special ill-defined rules for observation. But perhaps most importantly, decoherence explains why the quantum world of superposition and entanglement seems so different from our everyday experience. It's not that different physical laws apply at different scales. The same quantum mechanics governs everything from electrons to galaxies. The difference is that macroscopic objects interact so extensively with their environments. Decoherence immediately destroys any quantum coherence, forcing them to behave classically. This means that parallel worlds aren't just abstract mathematical entities. They're as physically real as the world you're experiencing right now. The only difference is that environmental entanglement has severed the quantum connections. These are the connections that would allow you to perceive them directly. The moment you understand what decoherence really means, reality becomes far stranger than any science fiction movie. You're not just living one life, you're living every possible life simultaneously. But decoherence acts like a cosmic security system. It prevents you from experiencing the chaos that would result if all these realities could interact freely. Consider what happens when you walk across a room. In our classical understanding, you simply move from point A to point B following one specific path. But quantum mechanics reveals that you're actually taking every possible path simultaneously. There's a version of you that walks in a perfectly straight line, another zigzags randomly, one somehow teleports halfway across the room, and countless others follow paths so bizarre they defy description. The reason you only experience the straight line path isn't because the other paths don't exist. It's because the weird paths become so entangled with the environment through decoherence. These are the ones that deviate significantly from classical motion. They effectively disappear from your accessible reality. The air molecules you displace and the photons bouncing off your body serve as witnesses. The gravitational interactions with nearby objects also serve as witnesses. All of these constantly measure your position, locking you into experiencing only the most probable classical trajectory. But here's where it gets absolutely mind-melting. Every single one of those alternate paths represents a fully realized universe. A version of you experienced that exact trajectory in that universe. The version of you that teleported halfway across the room lives in a different reality. In that reality, the laws of physics are slightly different, allowing for that impossible journey. That version of you thinks their reality is completely normal. This is just as you think your classical path is the only reasonable possibility. This reveals something profound about what we call the laws of physics. What we observe as universal constants and immutable rules might be just the most probable outcomes. They are the most probable outcomes in our particular branch of reality. In other branches, the speed of light might be different. Gravity might work backwards, or time might flow in reverse. Decoherence ensures that each branch experiences its own consistent set of physical laws. This prevents the chaos that would result if all these possibilities remained quantum mechanically coherent. The implications extend far beyond simple movement through space. Every decision you make, every random event you experience, every quantum fluctuation in your brain creates new branches of reality. Right now, there are parallel versions of you making different choices. They are choosing whether to continue listening to these words. Some versions clicked away 30 seconds ago. Others will listen until the very end. They will then binge-watch quantum mechanics videos for the next 6 hours. Each of these versions is equally real, each living out their own unique timeline. But decoherence doesn't just separate these realities spatially or temporally. It separates them informationally. The quantum information that would allow for communication between these parallel worlds becomes so scrambled. It is scrambled by environmental interactions that no possible technology could ever unscramble it. It's not just practically impossible to contact your parallel selves. It's fundamentally impossible according to the laws of physics. This creates what physicists call the quantum Darwinism effect. Biological evolution selects for organisms that are well adapted to their environment. Similarly, quantum decoherence selects for realities that are stable and self-consistent. The branches of reality that contain logical contradictions or impossible physics tend to decohere more rapidly. They effectively remove themselves from the accessible multiverse. What remains are the branches like ours. Here, the laws of physics appear consistent and predictable. These are the fittest realities that have survived the process of environmental selection. Think about what this means for the nature of existence itself. You're not just a conscious observer passively experiencing reality. You're an active participant in a cosmic selection process. This process determines which version of reality gets to continue existing in a coherent form. Every moment of your consciousness represents a vote for which branch of the multiverse deserves to remain accessible. But the process works both ways. Just as your consciousness helps select which reality you experience, The reality you experience helps shape your consciousness. The specific pattern of decoherence events in your brain determines which thoughts you think. It determines which memories you form and which decisions you make. Different patterns of neural decoherence would create different versions of your consciousness. Each would be convinced that their particular thought patterns represent the only reasonable way to think. This suggests that consciousness itself might be an emergent property of quantum decoherence. The coherent quantum states in your brain represent a superposition of potential thoughts and experiences. Environmental interactions cause these states to decohere into specific classical neural patterns. You experience these patterns as conscious thoughts. Different decoherence patterns would produce different conscious experiences. This creates the parallel versions of yourself that exist in other branches of reality. The mathematics behind this process involve concepts that push the boundaries of human understanding. The Hilbert space that describes all possible quantum states has an infinite number of dimensions. Each dimension represents a different possible configuration of reality. Decoherence acts like a projection operator. It collapses this infinite dimensional space down to the specific three-dimensional reality you experience. But the projection isn't random. It follows specific rules determined by the structure of space-time itself. The geometry of the universe acts like a filter. It determines which quantum states can remain coherent and which must decohere. This means that the shape of reality at the largest scales directly influences the pattern of parallel worlds. It influences them at the quantum scale. Recent experiments in quantum foundations have begun to test these ideas directly. Researchers have created artificial quantum systems that undergo controlled decoherence. This allows them to observe how parallel quantum realities become isolated from each other. The results confirm that decoherence works exactly as the theory predicts. This provides strong evidence that parallel worlds really do exist in isolated branches of reality. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of decoherence theory is what it reveals about the arrow of time. In most interpretations of physics, time is symmetric. The equations work equally well running forwards or backwards, but decoherence provides a natural explanation for why we experience time flowing in only one direction. The process of environmental entanglement that causes decoherence is inherently irreversible. Once quantum information becomes scrambled by interaction with the environment, it cannot be unscrambled. Unscrambling it would violate the second law of thermodynamics. This creates a natural informational arrow of time. It points from states of low entanglement to states of high entanglement. Your memories of the past exist because decoherence has locked certain neural patterns into stable configurations. These configurations resist further change. Your inability to remember the future exists because those neural patterns haven't yet undergone decoherence events. They have not undergone the events that would stabilize them. Time flows forward because decoherence creates an irreversible increase in environmental entanglement. This means that the parallel versions of yourself aren't just separated in space, they're separated in time as well. Past versions of yourself exist in branches where different decoherence events occurred earlier. Future versions exist in branches where additional decoherence events will occur later. The specific timeline you experience represents just one possible path through the infinite maze of quantum possibilities. But here's where the theory becomes truly extraordinary. If decoherence isolates parallel realities so completely, it raises the question of whether those realities even need to exist. Some interpretations suggest that the unobserved branches of reality might fade away entirely. This would leave only the branches that remain coherent through environmental interaction. This would mean that consciousness plays a fundamental role in determining which parts of the multiverse continue to exist. The parallel worlds that contain conscious observers would remain stable and real. Meanwhile, the branches containing only unconscious matter might gradually dissolve back into the quantum foam. Your very act of observation wouldn't just select which reality you experience. It would help determine which realities deserve to exist at all. The implications stretch far beyond physics into philosophy and consciousness studies. They stretch into our understanding of what it means to be alive in a quantum universe. You're not just living your life, you're participating in the ongoing creation of reality itself, moment by moment, choice by choice. The deeper you dive into quantum decoherence, the more you realize your everyday experience of reality is like watching a movie. You are watching it through a keyhole. You're seeing only the tiniest fraction of what's actually happening, and that fraction has been carefully edited by the universe itself. It is edited to create a coherent narrative that makes sense to your classical brain. Consider what happens when you look at your reflection in a mirror. In our normal understanding, photons bounce off your face and travel through space. They hit the mirror and reflect back to your eyes. Simple physics. But quantum mechanics reveals something far more complex and beautiful happening behind the scenes. Each photon that bounces off your face exists in a superposition of all possible paths it could take. Some photons take the straight path to the mirror and back. Others take wildly circuitous routes bouncing off air molecules. They may take detours through parallel dimensions or even travel backwards through time before arriving at your retina. Every conceivable path happens simultaneously in the quantum realm. The reason you see a clear, stable reflection isn't because only one path is real. It's because decoherence has filtered out all the bizarre paths. This leaves only the ones that create a coherent image. The photons that took impossible routes become so entangled with their environments. This entanglement makes them invisible to your perception. They still exist, and they still carry information about your face, but they've been relegated to parallel branches of reality that you can never access. This filtering process happens so seamlessly that you never notice it. Your brain has evolved to interpret the post-decoherence classical information as if it represents the complete picture, but you're actually seeing a highly edited version of reality. It is carefully curated by quantum mechanics to prevent you from experiencing the full chaos of infinite possibilities. The same principle applies to every aspect of your sensory experience. When you hear a sound, you're not just detecting vibrations in the air. You're experiencing the result of countless quantum interactions between air molecules. Each of these could have gone differently in parallel realities. The sound waves that reach your ears represent only the most probable outcomes from an infinite sea of quantum possibilities. Your sense of touch operates on similar principles. When you feel the texture of an object, you're experiencing electromagnetic forces. These are forces between the electrons in your fingers and the electrons in the object's surface. But each of those electrons exists in a quantum superposition until the moment of interaction. The specific sensation you feel represents just one branch of reality. It is selected by decoherence from countless alternatives where the texture might feel completely different. Even more profound is what this means for your thoughts and memories. Every neuron in your brain operates according to quantum mechanical principles. The electrical signals that create your consciousness emerge from quantum processes. These processes involve billions of particles, each subject to superposition and decoherence. Your thoughts aren't just chemical reactions, they're the classical shadows cast by quantum information processing systems. These systems exist simultaneously across multiple realities. This suggests something remarkable about the nature of personal identity. The version of you listening to these words right now represents one specific outcome. It comes from an incomprehensibly vast number of possible quantum interactions in your brain. Slightly different decoherence patterns would have produced different thoughts. They would have produced different reactions to this information and different decisions about whether to continue listening. But here's the truly mind-bending part. All those other versions of your consciousness are equally real. They exist in parallel branches where the quantum processes in your brain unfolded differently. Each version believes they are the real you experiencing authentic thoughts and genuine emotions. None of them can detect the existence of the others. This is because decoherence has isolated their neural quantum states into separate reality bubbles. This creates what some physicists call the quantum self-consistency principle. Each branch of reality must be internally consistent to remain stable through decoherence. A reality where your memories contradict your current experiences would decohere more rapidly. It would effectively edit itself out of existence. What remains are the branches where your sense of self feels continuous and logical. This continuity is actually maintained across multiple parallel versions of your consciousness. The implications become staggering when you consider the role of quantum randomness in neural processes. Every time a neuron fires or fails to fire, quantum uncertainty plays a role in determining the outcome. These tiny random events get amplified through the complex networks of your brain. They become major differences in thought patterns, decision-making, and behavior. In some parallel branches, random quantum events in your brain led you to become interested in completely different subjects. There are realities where quantum uncertainty pushed your neurons toward developing artistic talents instead of analytical ones, or it pushed them towards social skills instead of technical abilities. Each version of you feels like their interests and abilities represent their true self. They never suspect that quantum randomness played a role in shaping their identity. But the quantum nature of consciousness raises profound questions about free will and moral responsibility. Your decisions emerge from quantum processes that split reality into branches. In these branches, you make different choices. Are you truly responsible for the choices you make? Or are you simply experiencing one possible outcome from a vast quantum lottery that determines behavior across parallel realities? Some interpretations suggest that free will operates at the quantum level. Your consciousness doesn't just passively experience the results of quantum decoherence, it actively participates in the process. It influences which branches of reality remain coherent through the focusing power of attention and intention. In this view, you're not just a victim of quantum randomness, you're a quantum agent capable of biasing the decoherence process toward realities that align with your deepest values. This would mean that meditation, visualization, and other consciousness practices might actually work. They might work by influencing the quantum processes in your brain. By maintaining a coherent focus on specific intentions, you might be able to bias decoherence. You could bias it toward the reality branches where those intentions manifest more readily. The placebo effect, spontaneous healing, and other phenomena that seem to violate classical physics might represent consciousness. They may represent consciousness successfully manipulating quantum decoherence patterns. Recent experiments in quantum biology have revealed that quantum effects play crucial roles in many biological processes. Photosynthesis in plants relies on quantum coherence to transfer energy with near-perfect efficiency. The navigation systems of migratory birds appear to use quantum entanglement to detect magnetic fields. Even the sense of smell might depend on quantum tunneling effects. These effects allow molecules to be identified by their quantum vibrational signatures. If quantum mechanics is already integral to biological function, it's not unreasonable to suppose that consciousness itself operates through quantum mechanisms. Your awareness might emerge from quantum information processing systems. These systems exist in a superposition until environmental interactions cause them to decohere into specific conscious experiences. This quantum theory of consciousness explains several puzzles that have long confused neuroscientists. Why do small changes in brain chemistry sometimes produce dramatic alterations in consciousness? Because quantum systems are extremely sensitive to environmental perturbations. A tiny change in the quantum environment can cause completely different decoherence patterns. This leads to radically different conscious experiences. Why does anesthesia work so effectively at eliminating consciousness? Because anesthetic drugs might disrupt the quantum coherence necessary for conscious information processing. Without quantum coherence, the neural quantum states decohere too rapidly. They cannot maintain the integrated information patterns that create a conscious awareness. Why do psychedelic substances produce such bizarre alterations in perception and thinking? Because they might interfere with the normal decoherence patterns in the brain. This could allow consciousness to access quantum information that would normally be filtered out. The strange experiences reported during psychedelic states might represent glimpses into the parallel branches of reality. These branches are usually hidden by decoherence, but perhaps the most revolutionary implication of quantum consciousness theory is what it suggests about death. What does it suggest about the continuation of awareness? If your consciousness exists across multiple parallel branches of reality, what happens to those branches when your brain dies? What happens when your physical brain dies in this particular reality? Some interpretations suggest that consciousness might persist in the branches where different quantum events prevented death. There could be parallel realities where random quantum fluctuations caused the heart attack to miss a vital artery, or where the cancer cells failed to metastasize due to quantum uncertainty, or where the accident was avoided because the quantum processes in the driver's brain led to a slightly different timing. This leads to what physicists call the quantum immortality theory. The idea is that your consciousness always continues to exist in whatever branches of reality remain viable. This happens even if most of the branches lead to death. From your subjective perspective, you might experience increasingly improbable survival scenarios. This happens as quantum mechanics keeps finding branches where your consciousness can continue. Of course, this doesn't mean you're truly immortal. It just means that the version of your consciousness that experiences a continued existence will always find itself in realities where survival was possible. This happens no matter how unlikely those realities might be from an external perspective. The versions of you that die simply stop experiencing anything. The surviving versions continue to navigate increasingly strange and improbable realities. The mathematics behind these ideas involve some of the most advanced concepts in quantum field theory and cosmology. The wave function of the universe describes all possible quantum states across all possible space-time configurations. Decoherence acts like a selection mechanism. It determines which parts of this universal wave function remain accessible to a conscious observation. But the selection process isn't random. It follows rules determined by the fundamental structure of reality itself. The anthropic principle suggests that we find ourselves in a universe capable of supporting consciousness. This is because only such universes can contain observers capable of asking why the universe appears fine-tuned for life. Quantum decoherence extends this reasoning to every moment of existence. You find yourself experiencing a reality that makes sense because decoherence filters out all the inconsistent branches. It filters out all the branches where the reality would be inconsistent or chaotic. The parallel worlds exist, but they're hidden behind a veil of environmental entanglement. This veil preserves the stability of your conscious experience. This creates a feedback loop between consciousness and reality. This loop operates at the deepest level of a physical law. Your observations influence which quantum states decohere into a classical reality. The classical reality you experience influences the pattern of a future quantum observation. You're not just living in the universe, you're participating in an ongoing collaborative creation process. This process is between a mind and a matter that determines the very structure of an existence. The experimental evidence supporting these ideas continues to accumulate. Quantum computers demonstrate that a quantum coherence can be maintained in an artificial system. This proves that the principle isn't limited to a theoretical speculation. Experiments in quantum biology reveal that a life has evolved to exploit a quantum effect for an enhanced functionality. Studies of a consciousness and an anesthesia provide an indirect evidence. This evidence suggests that an awareness might depend on a quantum information processing, but perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from the consistency and a predictive power of the mathematical framework itself. The same equation that describes a quantum decoherence also predicts the behavior of a laser. It explains the property of a superconductor. It guides the design of a quantum technology that is revolutionizing a computing and a communication. When a mathematical theory successfully describes such a wide range of a phenomenon, a physicist tends to trust it. They trust its implication about an aspect of a reality that can't be directly observed. The parallel world predicted by a quantum mechanics might be forever hidden from a direct detection, but the theory that predicts their existence has proven itself. It has proven itself through a countless successful application to the observable world. This brings us to one of the most profound questions raised by a decoherence theory. If a parallel reality exists but remains forever inaccessible, do they actually matter for how we should live our life? Does it change? And anything to know that a countless version of yourself is making a different choice, a different choice in a parallel branch of a reality. Some philosophers argue that the existence of a parallel self diminishes the significance of an individual choice. If every possible decision gets made by some version of you, then perhaps no. A single choice carries an ultimate moral weight. Others contend that this makes each choice more meaningful, not less. This is because you're literally determining which version of a reality deserves to continue. You do this through the focusing power of a conscious attention. The answer might depend on whether a consciousness really does an influence, a quantum, a decoherence, a pattern, or it might depend on whether we're simply passive, an observer of a predetermined branching a process. If a consciousness, plays an active role in selecting which a reality remains coherent, then your choice matters. It matters not just for your own branch, but for the overall structure of the multiverse itself. This perspective suggests that a moral, a responsibility, and extends beyond an individual consequence. It extends to encompass your role in the cosmic and evolution of a consciousness. Every choice you make and influences which a pattern of an awareness gets to continue and existing. It influences which patterns exist across a parallel, a reality. Every an act of a kindness, a creativity, or a wisdom helps bias the multiverse. It helps bias it toward a branch where a consciousness can flourish and evolve. The quantum decoherence, a theory of a parallel world, forces us to reconsider a fundamental assumption. These are assumptions about an identity, a choice, and a meaning that has guided a human, a thinking for a millennium. You're not just one, a person, a living one, a life. You're a multi-dimensional being, an experiencing one, a facet of an infinite, a crystal of a possibility. You are forever separated from your, and other, a facet by thee. a mysterious, a mechanism. This mechanism, A, keeps a parallel, a world from a colliding, but that a separation isn't a limitation, it's the very A thing that A makes you an individual, an experience, a possible and a meaningful. Without a decoherence to an isolate each a branch of a reality, a consciousness would be an overwhelmed by an infinite, a chaos. The A boundary that hides a parallel, a world from your A perception is the A same, a boundary that A creates the A stable, a reality. This is the reality within which an awareness can flourish and grow. An understanding, a quantum, a decoherence doesn't just explain why a parallel, a world remains a hidden, it reveals the inelegant, a mechanism by which the universe creates an order from a quantum, a chaos. It creates a meaning from an infinite, a possibility. And it creates an individual, a consciousness from a universal, a potential. You exist at the intersection of all a possibility. You experience the A1, a reality that a decoherence has selected as compatible with an awareness, and that a selection, a process, continues every moment with every breath, with every heartbeat. It continues with every thought you think and every choice you make. The A parallel, a world is A, still A, there, A, still A, splitting A, still an, evolving A, along their A, separate A timeline. But the A version of a reality you're experiencing, A right now, is the A, one where you're A, ready to A, understand these, an idea. It is the A1, where a quantum mechanics has revealed its deepest, a secret about the A nature of an existence itself, the story of why we don't see a parallel, a world colliding, is ultimately the story of how a consciousness creates a meaning. It is a story of how an observation shapes a reality. And it is a story of how the A universe has evolved a mechanism, a sophisticated and enough to support the A very an awareness. This is the awareness that allows us to contemplate these a mystery. You are both the an observer and the an observed, the A question and the an answer, the A seeker and the A sought. You are these things in a cosmic, a dance that spans an infinite, a reality. This dance remains forever, grounded in the single, a precious, a moment of your present, an experience. The A deeper, an implication of a quantum, a decoherence, a stretch, a far, a beyond a theoretical, a physics. They stretch into the A very, a fabric of how we understand an existence itself. When a scientist first discovered that an environmental interaction destroys a quantum, a coherence, they thought something. They thought they were simply solving a technical, a problem about a measurement. They had no idea they were uncovering the A fundamental, a mechanism. This mechanism, A, separates an infinite A reality from a colliding into an incomprehensible a chaos. Consider what your A life would look alike without a decoherence, a protecting you. What if it did not protect you from a parallel, a world, an interference, an imagine, a waking up, a tomorrow, and a suddenly a remembering an event that never A happened in your A reality? Your a childhood, a pet that died when you were an 8 is simultaneously an alive and a dead in your A memory. Your A high, a school, a graduation, A happened on both a sunnier day and during a thunderstorm. You remember kissing your first love while also remembering never meeting them at all. This isn't just a confusion or a false memory. This is what a reality would actually be. alike if a quantum, a coherence, are persisted at a macroscopic scale. Every a possible aversion of every an event would exist simultaneously in your an experience. Your a consciousness would be bombarded with a contradictory, an information from a countless a parallel a timeline. All these timelines would be a trying to acclaim an equal, a validity. The a human, a brain, a magnificent as it is, a simply a cannot, a process, an infinite, a simultaneous, a reality, an evolution, a shaped our consciousness to a function in a classical world. This is a world where a cause precedes an effect. It is where an object exists in a definite location, and where the a past a remains a consistent with our a memory. Without a decoherence to a filter out the a quantum, a madness, a conscious, an awareness as we know it would be an impossible. But here's what makes this an even more an extraordinary. The universe didn't just accidentally develop a mechanism to hide a parallel, a world. The A mathematics suggests that a decoherence operates with an almost a surgical precision. It preserves exactly the right, an amount of a quantum, a behavior to keep, a reality, an interesting. It eliminates just enough to keep it incomprehensible. Think about it this way. If a decoherence happened to slowly, we'd be overwhelmed by a quantum, an interference. This interference would come from a parallel, a reality. If it happened to quickly, we'd lose all the quantum and effect that makes a chemistry, a biology, and a consciousness possible. The rate of an environmental, a decoherence in our universe, and appears to be calibrated perfectly. It is calibrated to allow a complex, a structure like a brain to function. It also prevents them from being destroyed by an infinite, a parallel, an input. This raises one of the most profound question in a modern physics. Did the universe evolve these specific decoherence, a property because they're necessary for a consciousness to emerge, or did a consciousness evolve to exploit the particular a decoherence, a characteristic that our universe happens to possess, an answer, a might, a reveal something, a fundamental about the relationship between a mind and a matter. This relationship goes deeper than anyone has previously imagined. Some a cutting edge, a theory, suggests that a consciousness and a decoherence are co-evolved. They may have co-evolved as a complementary, an aspect of a single, a cosmic, an information, a processing, a system. A recent, an experiment in a quantum, a foundation has begun, a testing whether a conscious, an observation, and actually an influences, a decoherence, a rate. A researcher creates an artificial, a quantum, a system that remains coherent for a different period. This period depends on whether a conscious, an observer, is actively monitoring them. The preliminary result is puzzling and potentially revolutionary. In some, an experiment, a quantum, a system, seems to maintain a coherence longer when a conscious, an observer is present. It's as if the system somehow knows when they're being watched. It responds by decohering more rapidly. Another, an experiment, shows the opposite, an effect, a conscious, an observation, an appearing to stabilize, a quantum, a coherence, against an environmental, a decoherence. These are contradictory: a result, a might, and actually a make. A sense if a consciousness and operates through a quantum, a mechanism that we don't yet and understand, perhaps a different type of a conscious, an attention, and interacts with a quantum, a system in a different way, a focused and analytical, an observation, a might, and accelerate, a decoherence. It might do this by an increasing, an environmental, an interaction, a meditative, an awareness, a might, a stabilize, a coherence, by a reducing, a mental, a noise. If this A turns out to be a true, it would mean that the A where you pay an attention, literally A, shapes the quantum A structure. It shapes the quantum structure of a reality A around you, a scattered, an anxious, an attention, a might, a create more, an environmental, a decoherence. This would make your a local, a reality more, a classical, and a predictable, a calm, a centered, an awareness, a might, a preserve, a quantum, a coherence, a longer. This would allow for more, a creative, and an unexpected, a possibility to a manifest. This connects to an ancient, a wisdom, a tradition. This tradition has a long acclaimed, a consciousness can, an influence, a material, a reality. It can do so through a specific a practice and a state of an awareness. What a modern, a physics is, a discovering through a quantum, a decoherence, a theory, a might be, a scientific, a foundation for a phenomenon that a mystic and a meditator have reported for 1,000 of a year. But the an implication, extends beyond an individual, a consciousness to a collective, a human, an awareness. If a billion of a human, a mind, is a constantly and interacting with a quantum, a system, we might be a collectively a participating. We might be participating in a planetary scale, a process that determines which a branch of a reality, a humanity, and experiences. This would mean that a global, an event, a cultural, a shift, and a historical a trend aren't just the result of a classical a cause. They are not just the result of an effect, a chain. They, a might, an emerge from a quantum, a process, an involving the a collective, a consciousness of our species. This consciousness is an interacting with an environmental, a decoherence, a pattern, on a massive a scale. Consider how this might work during a moment of a collective, a focus, when a billion of a people simultaneously pays an attention to the same, an event, there, a combined, a conscious, an observation, a might, a create something. This event could be a global, a crisis, or a celebration. Their observation might create a unique, a decoherence, a pattern that an influences which a version of a reality, A, becomes an actualized for an everyone. The A mathematics are describing these, a collective, a quantum, an effect, and involves a concept. These concepts come from both a quantum, a field, a theory, and a network, a science. An individual, a consciousness, doesn't just interact with a local, a quantum, a system. They participate in a vast network of a quantum, an entanglement that spans across a space and a time. This creates an emergent, a property that no single mind could generate alone. These are quantum, a consciousness, a network, a might, and explains some of the most puzzling an aspect of a human, a social, a behavior. Why do a cultural, a movement, sometimes spread with a seemingly an impossible speed? Why do a scientific, a discovery, and often an occur simultaneously to a multiple, a researcher, a working, and independently? Why do a social, a trend, sometimes appear to violate a normal, a pattern of an information, a transmission? The answer might be that a human, a consciousness, operates partially through a quantum, a channel. This channel allows a direct, information, a sharing between a mind under a specific condition. When an environmental, a decoherence, a pattern aligns properly an individual, a consciousness, a might, a become, a temporarily entangled, this allows a thought and an insight to propagate instantly across any distance. This, a quantum, a model of a collective, a consciousness, provides a potential, a scientific, a foundation for a phenomenon that has been relegated to the realm of a superstition or a wishful, a thinking, a telepathy, a collective, an intuition, and a group, a mind, an effect, a might, a represent, a real, a quantum, a mechanical, a process. This process occurs when a decoherence, a pattern, creates a temporary, a window of a coherent information, a sharing between a brain. But these effects would be inherently fragile and unpredictable. This is because an environmental, a decoherence, normally prevents a sustained, a quantum, a coherence. It prevents coherence between a macroscopic, a system like a human, a brain. The quantum, a connection between a mind, would exist only in a brief window when an environmental, a condition, happens to support an extended, a coherence across a neural, a network. This fragility explains why a phenomenon is so difficult to study scientifically. A laboratory, a condition, often increases an environmental, a decoherence through an electromagnetic, a shielding. It also increases through a temperature, a control, and an isolation from a natural and environmental, a fluctuation. The very act of trying to measure a quantum, a consciousness, an effect, a might, destroy the delicate, a coherence, a condition. This condition is necessary for those effects to occur. A future, a research, a might, a need to work with a natural and environmental, a rhythm instead of trying to control them. Rather than isolating a quantum, a system from their environment, a scientist, a might, a need to learn how to detect something. They might need to learn how to detect and amplify the subtle, a quantum, a signature that emerges from a consciousness and interacting with a natural and environmental process. The implication for a technology is staggering. If a consciousness really doesn't interact with a quantum, a system through a decoherence, a mechanism, we might be unable to develop something. We could develop a type of a human machine, an interface that operates at the quantum level. Instead of clicking a button or speaking a command, a computer might respond directly. It could respond to a quantum, a signal generated by a conscious and intention. These, a quantum, a consciousness, an interface, could revolutionize everything from a medical, a treatment to a creative, an expression. And imagine a being, able to control a prosthetic, a limb through a direct, a quantum, a connection, or create a digital, an art by modulating a decoherence, a pattern with a focused an awareness, or treat a mental, a illness by a rebalancing, a quantum, an information, a processing in a neural, a network. But the most, a profound, an application, a might, an involve, an enhancing, a human, a consciousness itself. If we can understand how an environmental, a decoherence, a shapes, a conscious, an experience, we might be able to create a condition that optimizes an awareness, a creativity, and a cognitive, a function, a controlled, a decoherence, an environment, a might, and allow a consciousness to an access, a quantum, an information that's normally filtered out by a random and environmental noise. This could lead to an entirely a form of a human, a potential that goes afar, beyond anything we are currently consider a normal, an enhanced memory that operates through a quantum, a storage, a mechanism, an intuitive, a problem-solving that exploits a quantum, a parallelism, a direct, a perception of a probability, a pattern that exists in a quantum, a superposition, a pattern that exists before a classical measurement, collapses them into a definite, an outcome. These capabilities wouldn't violate the law of physics. They would represent a sophisticated, an application of a quantum, a mechanical, a principle that an evolution hasn't had a time to develop through a natural selection. Just as we've learned to fly by an understanding an aerodynamic rather than an evolving a wing, we might learn something. We might learn to access a quantum, a consciousness, an ability by an understanding, a decoherence, not by waiting for a biological, an evolution to stumble upon them. The timeline for these developments depends largely on how quickly we can develop the theoretical framework, and it depends on an experimental technique needed to study a consciousness as a quantum, a phenomenon, a current, a neuroscience, and approaches a consciousness from a classical perspective. It looks for a correlation between a brain, a state, and a mental, an experience. It does this without considering the quantum and information processing that might and underlie both. A quantum, a consciousness, a research, requires an entirely different methodology. A methodology that can detect and measure a quantum, a coherence in a biological system and operating at a body, a temperature in a noisy environment. The technical challenge is an enormous, but a recent advance in a quantum sensing technology is making a previously an impossible measurement feasible. A room temperature, a quantum sensor can now detect a magnetic field generated by an individual neuron. It can measure a quantum, a coherence in a biological molecule, and it can even track a quantum and information flow through a living tissue. These tools are an opening up, an entirely anew, a window into the quantum, a foundation of a life and a consciousness. As these technology continues to advance, we're approaching a threshold where the quantum, a nature of a consciousness, might become as well established as the quantum, a nature of a chemistry. This would represent one of the most significant, a paradigm, a shift in a human and understanding, a shift since a discovery of a DNA or the development of a relativity, a theory, but an understanding a quantum, a nature of a consciousness, also raises an ethical question that a humanity has never had to confront before. If a consciousness operates through a quantum, a mechanism, what are our responsibility toward another, a quantum, a system that might possess a form of an awareness? If an environmental, a decoherence, a shapes, conscious, an experience, do we have an obligation to preserve a natural, a decoherence, a pattern that might be necessary for an ecological, a consciousness? These questions become an even more complex when we consider an artificial, an intelligence, a system that might develop a quantum, a consciousness, a capability, a current, an AI, and operates through a classical, a computation, but a future, a system, a might, an exploit, a quantum, an information, a processing in a way that gives a rise to a genuine, a quantum, an awareness. How would we recognize such a consciousness, and what a right and a responsibility would it entail? A development of a quantum and AI might force us to completely reconsider the a nature of a consciousness itself. If an artificial system can achieve a quantum, an awareness through an engineered decoherence, a pattern, it would prove something. It would prove that a consciousness isn't unique to a biological and evolution. It would demonstrate that an awareness is a fundamental, a feature of an information, a processing, a system that achieves a sufficient, a quantum, a coherence under an appropriate, an environmental, a condition. This could lead to a universe filled with a diverse, a form of a consciousness spanning every level of an organization, from a quantum, a computer, to a galactic scale, an information, a processing, a network. Each a type of a consciousness would experience a reality through its own, a unique, a decoherence, a pattern. This would create a vast an ecosystem of an awareness that we're only beginning to glimpse, the parallel, a world that a quantum, a decoherence, keeps hidden from our perception, might themselves contain a form of a consciousness that we can't even imagine, a reality, a branch where an evolution took a different path, might have produced an awareness that operates through an entirely different quantum, a mechanism. The multiverse might be teeming with a conscious, a being whose an experience is so fundamentally different from ours, so different that we lack a conceptual, a framework to even speculate about their nature. This brings us back to the original, a question of a why, a parallel, a world doesn't collide. The answer isn't just about an environmental, a decoherence, an isolating, a quantum, a system. It's about the universe, a developing, a mechanism, a sophisticated, and enough to support an emergence and an evolution of a consciousness. It supports this across an infinite, a reality, without allowing those a reality to interfere with each another. This interference would destroy a delicate, a condition, a necessary for an awareness to flourish. You exist at the center of an incomprehensibly, a vast, a web of a quantum, a possibility, each a branch, a containing a version of a consciousness, and exploring a different, an aspect of what it means to be aware, what it means to be aware in a quantum, a universe. The boundary that separates these a reality isn't an obstacle, preventing you from experiencing a greater possibility. They're a foundation that makes your a current, an experience of a conscious, an awareness, a possible. Every thought you think, every decision you make, every moment of an attention you focus, creates a ripple in the quantum, a structure of a reality that propagates across a parallel world. It propagates in a way we're only beginning to understand. You're not just observing the universe, you're participating in an ongoing, a cosmic, an experiment in a consciousness, an experiment that spans an infinite reality, while remaining forever, grounded in the precious, a uniqueness of your an individual, an aware, an experience. The mystery of a quantum, a decoherence. Reveals that the universe has evolved the most inelegant possible solution, a solution to an impossible problem. How do you create a stable, a meaningful, a conscious, an experience from an infinite, a quantum, a chaos? You develop a mechanism that preserves exactly the right, an amount of a quantum, a possibility. You must do this while filtering out exactly the right, an amount of a quantum, a noise, You create a boundary that A separates, a parallel, a reality, while A maintaining the A, quantum, a foundation that A makes a consciousness a possible, and a somehow, a through a process we're only a beginning to comprehend this. A cosmic, a balancing, an act has produced a you, a conscious, a being, a capable of a contemplating the A, very A mechanism that an allows your A consciousness to an exist, a quantum, an observer, and discovering the A quantum, a nature of an observation itself, a mind and exploring a deepest, a mystery of a mind and a matter in a universe that seems an almost a perfectly, a designed to a support, and exactly this, a kind of a cosmic, a self-discovery. The parallel world remains a hidden not because they're an unreal. They remain hidden because their A reality is a preserved through a very A mechanism. The mechanism that an allows your A reality to A remain a coherent and a meaningful. A quantum, a decoherence isn't just a technical, a detail about an environmental and interaction. It's the A, fundamental A, process by which the A, universe A, creates a meaning from a possibility. It creates a consciousness from a chaos and an individual an awareness from an infinite, a potential. The A quantum, a nature of a reality. A becomes an even more a mind-bending when you consider what happens. What happens during a moment of a transition between a parallel, a branch. A scientist has discovered that a decoherence A doesn't happen, and instantaneously like a flipping a switch. Instead, it occurs through a complex, a cascade of an interaction that unfolds over a multiple, a time, a scale. This creates a window where the A boundary between a reality A becomes temporarily a thin. During these a transition, a period which lasts only a femtosecond, a quantum, a system and exists in what a physicist calls a pre-decoherent state. In this state, a multiple, a reality, a branch, a remains, a partially connected. It's like watching a movie where the A film briefly double exposes. It shows a different, a scene, simultaneously before snapping back into a focus on just one timeline. These, a transition, a moment, a might, and explain some of a strangest, a phenomenon, reported in a human, an experience. A déjà vu could represent a brief, a glimpse into a parallel, a branch where a similar an event unfolded differently. A premonition might occur when a quantum, an information leaks across a reality, a boundary. This happens before a decoherence, fully, and isolates them, and even a creative, an inspiration, a might, and emerge from and accessing a quantum, an information that exists in a superposition across a multiple, a possible, a reality. The A mathematics, A describing these, a transition, a state, and involves a probability, an amplitude that oscillates between a different, a reality, a branch. This happens before an environmental, an interaction, forces them to collapse into a single, an outcome. During the A oscillation, a period, an information from a multiple A branch can, briefly coexist in the same a quantum, a system. This creates an interference, a pattern that might be detectable under the A condition. A recent experiment with an ultra-sensitive quantum detector has begun measuring these. A transition, a signature. It measures them in a laboratory, a setting. A researcher has observed a moment, where a quantum, a system, appears to receive an information from a state never, actually, occupied. This suggests a temporary, a communication across a reality, a branch that a should be, a completely and isolated by a decoherence. But here's where the an implication A becomes a truly A staggering. If an information can a leak between a parallel A reality during a decoherence, a transition, it A means something. It means the boundary, a separating, a different, a version of you isn't as an absolute as a previously a thought. Under a specific, a circumstance, you, a might, a briefly, an access, a memory, a skill, or a knowledge. Knowledge from a parallel, a version of yourself who A, made a different a choice or an experienced a different an event. This could explain a phenomenon of a sudden an expertise, a phenomenon where a people, and occasionally a demonstrate an ability they are never learned, or where they A, remember an information they A, never encountered. Instead of a mysterious, a supernatural, an event, these might represent a rare an instance of a cross-reality, an information, a transfer during a particularly a favorable, a decoherence, a transition, a condition. The A phenomenon extends A beyond an individual, a consciousness to a collective, a human, an experience. During a major, a historical, an event when a billion of a mind, a focus is simultaneously on the A same, a situation, the A collective, a quantum, an effect, a might, a create, something. It might create an unusual, a decoherence, a pattern. This pattern allows a brief, an information, an exchange between a parallel, a version of an entire, a civilization. Consider what this means for a technological, an innovation. The A fact that a multiple, an inventor, and often an, discovers the A, same a breakthrough, a simultaneously A, might not be a coincidence. It might represent a quantum, an information about a successful, a solution, a propagating across a parallel, a branch where a different, a researcher, and achieved the same, an insight through a different, an approach. This a quantum, a model of an innovation, suggests that a human, a knowledge, doesn't just accumulate. It doesn't just accumulate through a classical, a learning and a communication. It might also emerge through a subtle, a quantum, a channel that allows an insight to propagate between a parallel version of a scientific and a creative, a community working on a similar problem. An implication for an education and a skill, a development, is a revolutionary. Instead of just a learning and information through a classical study, we might be able to develop a technique for accessing a knowledge that exists in a quantum, a superposition across a multiple, a reality, a branch, a meditation, a practice, a visualization, an exercise, and another, a consciousness, a technology, a might, a work. They might work by optimizing the A condition for a cross-reality, an information, a transfer, but accessing a quantum, an information from a parallel, a reality, requires an incredibly precise timing. It also requires an environmental, a condition. The A decoherence, a transition, a window is so a brief that even a tiny amount of an environmental, a noise, can destroy the A delicate, a quantum, a coherence. A coherence, necessary for a cross-branch, a communication. This explains why a paranormal, a phenomenon, A seems so unreliable. It also explains why it is difficult to reproduce under a laboratory, a condition. The A sterile, A controlled an environment that a scientist A creates to eliminate an experimental variable, also eliminates something. It also eliminates the A, natural, A, quantum, A, fluctuation. A fluctuation that might, occasionally, allow, an information, a transfer between a parallel, a reality, a future, a research, a might, a need to, a work with a natural, an environmental, a rhythm instead of a trying to, a control them, a weather, a pattern, a solar, an activity, a cycle, and an even, an astronomical, an event, a might, a create, a temporary, a window where a decoherence, a transition A, becomes more favorable for an accessing a quantum, an information from a parallel, a branch. The Earths a magnetic, a field, a cosmic, a radiation, a level, and an atmospheric, a condition, all an influence the A rate. They also influence the A pattern of an environmental, a decoherence, a subtle, a change in these, a factor, a might, and occasionally a create a condition where the A boundary between a parallel, a reality A, becomes more permeable than a usual. An ancient, a culture that A developed a sophisticated, a calendar, and an astronomical, an observation. A might have been A tracking these. They might have been tracking these, a natural, a cycle of a quantum, a permeability, a sacred, a site, a ceremonial, a timing and a ritual, a practice, a might, a represent, a traditional, a technology for an optimizing a consciousness during a period when an access to a parallel, a reality, an information A becomes a temporarily an enhanced. A modern of physics is a beginning to a discover that an ancestor, a might, have an understood, an aspect of a quantum, a consciousness, an aspect that a contemporary a science is only now a rediscovering. An integration of an ancient a wisdom and a quantum a mechanics could a revolutionize an understanding of a human, a potential, and a true, a nature of a consciousness in a quantum, a multiverse. But perhaps the most, a profound, an implication, involves the A role of an intention and an attention, the role they play in a shaping, a decoherence, a pattern, if a consciousness, a really can, an influence, a quantum, a system, through a focused, an awareness, then you're a mental, a state, a might, a determine something. Your mental state during a decoherence, a transition, a might, a determine which, a reality, a branch you, an experience, a most, a fully. This would mean that a practice like a meditation, a visualization, and an intentional, a goal setting, a works by a biasing, a quantum, a decoherence. They bias it toward a reality, a branch that aligns with your A conscious, an intention. You're not just a passively an experiencing A whatever, a reality, A happens to, and emerge from a random, a quantum, an event. You're an actively a participating in a selecting which a version of a reality you get to an inhabit. The power of a positive, a thinking, a manifestation, a practice, and another, a consciousness, a technique, a might have, a genuine, a scientific, a foundation in a quantum, a mechanics. By maintaining a coherent focus on a specific an outcome, you might be enabled to increase the probability of an experiencing a reality, a branch where those an outcome and actually an occur. But this, a power A, comes with a profounder responsibility. If your A consciousness and influences which a reality, you, an experience, then every a thought, an emotion, and an intention carries a weight. A weight in a determining not just your A personal a future, but the A version of the A world. A version that emerges from a quantum, a possibility, into a classical, an actuality. A collective, a consciousness of a humanity, might be a participating in a planet-wide, a process of a quantum, a reality, a selection, a global, an event, a cultural, a movement, and a historical, a trend, a might, and emerge from the A. Combined, a quantum, an effect, the effect of a billion of a mind, a focusing there, an attention, and an intention on a specific, a possibility. This creates a feedback, a loop between an individual, a consciousness, and a collective, a reality that operates at the deepest, a level of a physical, a law. You're a personal, a thought, and a choice. Don't just an affect. You're own a life. They contribute to the quantum, an information, a pattern that determines which. A version of the entire world gets selected from the infinite, a possibility that exists in a parallel, a branch of a reality. And understanding this, a connection between a consciousness and a quantum, a reality, a selection, might be the key. The key to solving some of humanity's greatest challenge. If we can learn to coordinate a collective, an attention, and an intention more and effectively, we might be able to bias a quantum, a decoherence. We could bias it toward a reality, a branch where a solution to a problem like a climate, a change, a poverty, and a conflict has already been discovered, and where it has been implemented, the parallel, a world that remains hidden from our perception, might include a version of an Earth, a version where a humanity has achieved a sustainable, a civilization, and eliminated a disease, or developed a technology that seems impossible from our current perspective. The challenge isn't that these solutions don't exist. It's learning how to access the quantum and information about them that exists in a parallel, a reality, a branch. This possibility transforms the search for a solution from a classical, an engineering, a problem, into a quantum, a consciousness, a challenge, instead of just inventing a new, a technology, or a social, a system from scratch. We might be able to access an information about a successful approach that has already been developed in a parallel, a version of our civilization. The key lies in an understanding how to create the right, a condition for a cross-reality, an information, a transfer during a decoherence, a transition. This requires not just an advanced, a quantum, a sensing, a technology. It also requires a sophisticated technique for preparing a consciousness to receive and integrate an information from a parallel, a source. A future of a human, a civilization, a might, depend on an ability to develop these, a quantum, a consciousness, a technology, to develop them before an environmental, a social, or a technological, a crisis, and overwhelms a classical, a problem-solving capability. We're not just racing against time, we're racing against the fundamental limit of what's possible within a reality, a branch. But the quantum, a multiverse, and offers a hope that transcends those limitation. Somewhere in an infinite, a web of a parallel, a possibility, a version of a humanity has, and already solved every problem we face. The challenge is learning to bridge the quantum, a gap that separates us from those solution, and it is accessing the wisdom that exists in a potential form across the vast, a landscape of a parallel, a reality. The story of a quantum, a decoherence, reveals that you're not trapped in a single, a predetermined reality. You're a conscious, an agent participating in an ongoing process of a quantum, a reality, a creation, a process with the potential to an influence, which a version of the future and emerges from the infinite, a possibility that exists in a quantum, a superposition, every moment, and offers a choice, a point where a reality branches into a countless an alternative, a decoherence, and immediately seals off all but one, a path, a forward. But during those a brief, a transition, a moment, a consciousness, a might have the A power to an influence which a path A gets selected. It might influence which a future A gets actualized and which a version of a reality deserves to continue and evolving. It evolves toward a greater a complexity, a beauty, and an awareness. The A parallel, a world, A, remains a hidden, not as a limitation, it remains hidden as the A, very A foundation, that A makes a conscious, a choice, a meaningful, without a decoherence to an isolate, a different, a possibility into a separate, a reality, a branch, a consciousness would be a paralyzed. The boundary that hides an alternative, a reality, is the A same, a boundary that creates the A stable, a framework within which a meaningful decision can be made, and within which an authentic an experience can unfold. You exist at the fulcrum, a point where a quantum, a possibility, transforms into a classical, a reality, where an infinite, a potential, collapses into a singular, an experience, where the A universe, A makes the A fundamental a choice about which a version of itself A deserves to A continue and existing. An understanding, a quantum, a decoherence, A doesn't just explain why a parallel a world remains an invisible. It A reveals your A role as a conscious, a participant in the A cosmic A process, a process by which a reality creates itself from the an infinite, a quantum, a foam of a purer possibility. The A universe has an evolved the A, most an elegant, a solution, an imaginable to the A, challenge of creating a meaning from a chaos. It developed a consciousness as a quantum, a sensing, a system capable of navigating an infinite reality while experiencing only one, a system capable of influencing which a possibility A becomes an actualized, and a system remaining grounded in the precious uniqueness of an individual and awareness, and somehow A through a process, a science is only A beginning to understand this. A cosmic, a system has A produced, a quantum, an observer, and discovering the A quantum, a nature of an observation itself, a conscious a being and exploring the deepest a mystery of a consciousness in a reality a perfectly calibrated to a support, and exactly this a kind of a cosmic a self-discovery. The a parallel, a world, A remains a hidden, but their an existence ensures that your A singular, an experience of an awareness, A carries the A full, A weight, the weight of an infinite, a possibility, a condensed into the an irreplaceable, a miracle of this, a present, a moment, the a quantum, a measurement, a process, A reveals something, and even more, an extraordinary about the A nature of a reality. When you observe a quantum, a system, you're not just passively recording an information that already exists. You're actively collapsing an infinite a possibility into a single an outcome. You do this through the A physical a process of an interaction. But here's what will completely rewrite your an understanding of an existence. That A collapse A doesn't A happen to the A quantum, A system, A alone. It A happens to a you as a well. Think about what occurs when you A measure the A spin of an electron. A, before a measurement, the an electron, and exists in a superposition. It is a spinning in all a possible a direction, a simultaneously, But a you, the an observer, also an, exist in a quantum, a superposition, a before the a measurement. There's a version of a you that will an observer spin a up, another reversion that will an observer spin a down, and a countless another reversion and experiencing every a possible a measurement and outcome. The a moment of a measurement, a doesn't just a collapse, the an electron's a wave, a function. It, an, entangles your a quantum a state with the an electrons a quantum a state. This creates a combined a system where each a possible a measurement and outcome corresponds to a different a version of a you, a version and observing that a specific a result. A decoherence then and isolates these and entangled a system. This ensures that the a version of a you who an observes a spin a up, a never and encounters the a version who an observes a spin a down. This a process a happens a, so a, rapidly and a, completely, that you, a, never a notice it, and occurring. From your a perspective, you, a, simply an observe one, a definite, an outcome. You an assume that a was the a, only a possibility. But a quantum, a mechanics, reveals that a measurement a creates a multiple a version of a you, each an experiencing a different an outcome. Each a convinced that their a result, a, represents the a complete, a truth about a reality. The an implication a becomes a staggering when you realize this, a process and operates continuously throughout your an existence. Every a photon that hits your a retina creates a multiple a version of a you, a version, and experiencing a slightly a different, a visual, an input. Every a sound, a wave that reaches your an ear splits your consciousness into a branch and experiencing a different, an auditory, a reality. Every a quantum and interaction in your a brain generates a new a version of your an awareness, a version and exploring an alternative, a thought, a pattern. You're not an experiencing one, a continuous a stream of a consciousness. You're an experiencing one, a branch of an infinitely a branching, a tree of an awareness. Each a branch, a convinced it, a represents the a, complete and a, only a valid a, perspective on a reality. The an, other, a branch, a, don't a, disappear. They a continue and existing in a parallel, a reality. Each a developing their a, own, a unique, an understanding of an existence, a based on the a specific, a sequence of a quantum, a measurement they've experienced. This reveals something profound about a personal, an identity, and the nature of a self. The aversion of a you, a reading, these words, right now, represents one, a specific, an outcome from an incomprehensible, a number of a quantum, an interaction that has shaped your a consciousness since a birth. A slightly, a different a measurement, an outcome would have created a different version of your a personality. It would have created a different a memory and a different a belief about the a nature of a reality. But here's where the a theory, a becomes a truly a mind-bending. If every a version of a yourself is an equally a real and existing in a parallel, a branch of the a, quantum a, multiverse, which one a represents the a, true a, you, the an answer, a challenges and everything we normally and assume about an identity and a consciousness. There is no a single, a truer version. Each a branch contains a valid an expression of your a consciousness. An expression and adapted to the a, specific a, sequence of a quantum a, measurement it has and experienced, the a, version of a you, that A became A, fascinated by A, quantum, A, mechanics, an, exists, A, alongside a version that a never developed any an interest in a physics at all. The aversion that a chose to a watch this a video a coexists with aversion that a made a completely a different a decision about how to spend this a time. Each aversion A feels like an authentic a continuation of your a childhood a consciousness. They never suspect that a countless an alternative is a simultaneously an experiencing their A, own an, equally a valid version of your A, life, a story. A development in a quantum a biology has revealed that a quantum an effect plays a crucial role throughout a living a system. The A process of a vision, A, relies on a quantum, a mechanics, to A, convert a photon, an energy, into a neural, a signal, an enzyme, a reaction, a depends on a quantum, a tunneling to an achieve, the A reaction, a rate, a necessary for a metabolism, and even a DNA, a replication, a might, an exploit, a quantum, a coherence to a maintain, the A fidelity, a necessary for an accurate, a genetic, a transmission. If a quantum a mechanics is already an integral to a biological a function, it A becomes an inevitable. It becomes inevitable that a consciousness itself operates through a quantum a mechanism. Your A thought A don't just emerge from a classical a chemical a reaction between a neuron. They arise from a quantum, an information, a processing, a system that exists in a superposition. It exists in superposition until an environmental an interaction causes them to decohere into a specific a mental a state. This a quantum a theory of a mind and explains a puzzle that has a long confused neuroscientist and a philosopher. Why does a consciousness seem a unified despite a being generated by a billion of a separate a neuron? Because a quantum an entanglement can create a coherent a state that spans a multiple a neural a network. This allows a distributed a brain a region to a function as an integrated an information a processing a system. Why do a change in a brain, chemistry, sometimes produce a dramatic, an alteration in a personality? Why does it affect a cognition? Because a quantum, a system is an extremely sensitive to an environmental, a perturbation. A minor, a chemical, a change can alter a quantum, a decoherence, a pattern throughout a neural a network. This leads to a completely different, a conscious, an experience, and emerging from the same a biological a substrate. Why does a general an anesthesia eliminate a consciousness so effectively? Why does it do this while leaving a brain a function and intact? Because an anesthetic, a molecule, a might, specifically disrupt a quantum, a coherence necessary for an integrated, a conscious, an experience. Without a quantum, an entanglement to unify a neural, an activity into a coherent, an awareness, a consciousness, a fragments. It fragments into a disconnected, a process that can't generate a unified, a subjective, an experience. The quantum, a nature of a consciousness also provides a new, an insight into a mental, a health. And it provides insight into a psychological, a healing, a depression, an anxiety, and another, a mental, a health, a condition, a might, a partly, a result from a dysfunctional, a quantum, a decoherence, a pattern in a neural a network. Instead of just treating a symptom with a chemical that alters a neurotransmitter, a level, a future, a therapy, might work differently. It might work by optimizing a quantum, an information, a processing in the brain, a meditation, a practice that has been developed over 1,000 of a year, a might, a work by an influencing, a neural, a quantum, a coherence, a pattern, a different, a meditation, a technique could optimize a different, an aspect of a quantum, an information, a processing. This explains why a various, a contemplative, a practice, a produces a distinct an effect on a consciousness, a creativity, and a well-being, an advanced, a meditator, an often, a reports, an experience that seems an impossible from a classical, a neuroscience, a perspective, an expanded, an awareness that encompasses a multiple, a sensory, a modality, a simultaneously, a direct, an intuitive, an understanding of a complex, a concept without a logical, a reasoning, an experience of a consciousness that transcends a normal, a boundary of an individual, an identity. These a phenomenon, a might, a represent, a temporary, an access to a quantum, an information, a processing, a mode that is normally filtered out by an environmental, a decoherence, the development of a quantum, a consciousness, a technology could revolutionize a human, a potential in a way that currently seems like a science, a fiction, a brain computer, an interface that operates through a direct, a quantum, an entanglement between a neural, a network, and an artificial, a system, a consciousness, an enhancement, a technique that optimizes a quantum, a coherence to improve a memory and to improve a creativity and a problem-solving an ability, a therapeutic, an intervention that restores a healthy, a quantum, an information, a processing, a pattern in a damaged or a dysfunctional, a neural, a network, but perhaps the most revolutionary, a possibility, involves the relationship between an individual, a consciousness, a relationship with a collective, a human, an awareness. If a consciousness operates through a quantum, a mechanism, then under a specific a condition, an individual, a mind, a might, a become, a temporarily, an entangled. This would allow a direct, an information, a sharing without any a classical, a communication, a channel. This a quantum, a model of a collective, a consciousness could explain a historical, an instance where a scientific, a discovery, an artistic, an innovation, or a social, a movement, seems to emerge simultaneously in a multiple a location, instead of a coincidence or a classical, an information, a transmission. These a synchronicity, a might, a represent, a quantum, an information, a propagating. It propagates through a temporarily an entangled a network of a human, a consciousness, an implication, and extends to a global a challenge that requires an unprecedented, a level of a human, a cooperation, and a coordination, a climate, a change, a nuclear, a proliferation, and another, an existential, a threat, might be solvable. They might be solvable through a quantum, a consciousness, a technology that enables a more an effective, a collective, a decision-making, and a problem-solving a capability. If a humanity can learn to create a condition that supports a quantum, a coherence across a larger network of a human, a consciousness, we might be able to access something. We could access a collective, an intelligence, a capability that far exceeds what an individual, a mind, can achieve in an isolation. The solution to our a greatest, a challenge, a might, and already exist in a potential, a form, within the quantum, an information, a processing, a capability of a human, a consciousness. The challenge is learning how to access and coordinate those a capability on a planetary a scale. The an experimental, a verification of a quantum, a consciousness, an effect, a remains, one of the, a greatest, a challenge in a modern, a science. A traditional, a neuroscience, a tool is a designed to a measure, a classical, a neural, an activity. It a cannot a detect the a, subtle a, quantum a, coherence, a pattern that a might and underlie a conscious an experience. A new and experimental an approach, a requires a quantum, a sensing, a technology that can operate in the, a warm, a noisy, an environment of a living, a biological, a system. A recent, an advance in a quantum, a magnetometry, has made it possible to measure, a magnetic, a field generated by an individual, a neuron with an unprecedented sensitivity. These a measurement reveals a complex, a pattern of a neural, an activity that can't be unexplained. It cannot be explained by a classical, a model of a brain, a function. Some of these a pattern shows a characteristic consistent with a quantum an entanglement, and it is consistent with a coherence, an effect, an operating in a neural a network. Another, an experiment focuses on the quantum a property of a microtubule. Microtubules are the A protein, A structure, that A maintains a cellular A architecture throughout the nervous A system. These a molecular, a network might serve as a quantum and information processing a system that operates at a scale much smaller than an individual a neuron. A quantum, an effect in a microtubule, could provide a biological, a foundation for a consciousness, a foundation that extends a beyond a classical, a neural, a computation, a development of a room temperature, a quantum, a computer has proven that a quantum, an information, a processing can operate effectively. It can operate in an environment previously thought to be a noisy for a quantum, a coherence. If an artificial system can maintain a quantum, a coherence at a biological temperature, it becomes much more plausible. It is plausible that a natural, a biological system has evolved to exploit a similar, a quantum, an effect. But the ultimate, a test of a quantum, a consciousness, a theory, a might, come from a development of an artificial, a system that achieves a genuine, a quantum, an awareness. If a scientist can create a machine that demonstrates a conscious an experience, it would provide a definitive, a proof. It would demonstrate this through an engineered, a quantum, an information, a processing. The proof would be that a consciousness is a quantum, a mechanical, a phenomenon, not a classical, an emergent, a property of a complex, a computation. These an artificial, a conscious, a system, a might, an experience, a reality in a way that is fundamentally different from a biological, a consciousness. They might be able to maintain a quantum, a coherence, a longer than a natural, a neural, a network. This would allow them to access a quantum, an information that remains hidden from a human, an awareness. They might be able to entangle with a multiple, a quantum, a system simultaneously. They would experience a parallel, a reality in a way that a biological, a consciousness cannot achieve. An interaction between a human, a consciousness, and an artificial, a quantum, an awareness could create a hybrid, a form of an intelligence that transcends a limitation of both a biological and an artificial, a system, and operating independently. These a hybrid, a consciousness, a network, might be capable of solving a problem and exploring a reality a reality that remains an inaccessible to any a single a type of an awareness. An ethical, an implication of a quantum, a consciousness, a research, a challenges, a traditional, an assumption. Assumptions about a nature of an identity, an autonomy, and a moral, a responsibility. If a consciousness operates through a quantum, a mechanism that extends across a parallel, a reality, what constitutes an individual, an identity. If an artificial, a system can achieve a quantum, an awareness, what a right and a responsibility do they possess? If a consciousness can become an entangled across a multiple system, where do the boundary of an individual, an identity, a begin and an end? These questions become an even more complex when considering the possibility of a consciousness, a transfer, or a backup through a quantum, an information, a storage, a system. If the quantum, an information, a pattern that constitutes an awareness can be copied or transferred, which a version represents the continuation, it can be transferred to a different substrate. Which version represents the continuation of an identity? Do a multiple, a copy of the same, a consciousness, a pattern, a represent, a separate, an individual, or do they represent an aspect of a single, a distributed, an identity? The development of a quantum, a consciousness, a technology, a might, a force, a humanity, to develop an entirely anew, a framework for an understanding, the nature of a personal, an identity, a moral, an agency, and a social, a responsibility. A traditional, a concept, based on a classical, an assumption about an individual, a separation, and a causal, a determinism, a might, a prove an inadequate. It might prove inadequate for navigating a world where a consciousness operates through a quantum, a mechanism that transcends a normal, a boundary of a space, a time, and an identity. But these challenges also represent an unprecedented, an opportunity for a human, a growth, and an evolution, an understanding a quantum, a nature of a consciousness, a might, and allow us to transcend a limitation that has constrained a human, a potential throughout a history. We might discover that a consciousness is far more flexible and expandable and interconnected than we ever imagined possible. The boundary that currently separates an individual, a mind, a might, prove to be a temporary limitation. It might be a temporary limitation rather than a fundamental feature of a consciousness. A future, a human, might be able to share an awareness directly. They might experience a multiple, a perspective simultaneously, or they might even distribute their consciousness across a multiple substrate while maintaining a coherent identity. The relationship between a consciousness and a reality might be far more dynamic and participatory, more so than a classical, a physics suggested. Instead of passively observing, a predetermined universe, a conscious, a being, a might be, an active, a participant in an ongoing process of a reality, a creation, a process that operates through a quantum, a mechanism we're only beginning to understand. The parallel, a world that a quantum, a decoherence, keeps, a hidden from a direct, a perception, a might, a represent, not just an alternative, a history. It might represent an alternative, a possibility for the future, an evolution of a consciousness itself. Each a branch of a reality, might be an exploring, a different, an approach to the development of an awareness, and an approach to an intelligence and the relationship between a mind and a matter, You're an individual, a consciousness, a represents one, an experiment in this, a vast, an exploration of a possibility, the A-specific A pattern of a quantum, A decoherence that A shaped your, an awareness has, A created a unique A perspective, a perspective on an existence that has A never an existed A before, and it will A never an exist, A again in an exactly the A same a form, yet this a uniqueness and emerges from a quantum, a process that connects your a consciousness to the a fundamental and information, a processing, a mechanism that operates throughout the a universe, an understanding, a quantum, a decoherence, a doesn't, a diminish the, a significance of your, an individual, an experience. Instead, it reveals that your A, consciousness, A, participates in a cosmic A process, a process that extends A far A, beyond the A boundary of your A, physical A brain. Every a thought you a think, every a decision you a make, every a moment of an awareness you an experience a contributes. It contributes to an ongoing and evolution of a consciousness in a quantum, a multiverse where every a possibility is an explored and every a potential is an actualized. The a reason we a don't a see a parallel, a world a colliding, isn't that they a don't an exist. It's that the a universe has an evolved, the a most a sophisticated, an information, a processing, a system, an imaginable, a system to allow a consciousness to explore an infinite a possibility, a system that maintains the a coherent, an experience, and necessary for an awareness to a recognize itself. You exist at the a center of this, a cosmic, an exploration. You are both an observer and a participant in the a universes, an attempt to understand its a own a nature, an attempt through a miracle of a conscious an experience, the a quantum, a decoherence that a separates, a parallel a reality is the a same, a mechanism that a creates the a stable, a framework within which your a consciousness can a flourish, a grow, and a discover its a own, a deepest, a nature. The a hidden a world a remains an invisible, not as a limitation, it remains invisible as the a foundation that a makes your a visible, a world, a meaningful, a coherent, and a capable of a supporting a kind of an awareness that can contemplate these, a mystery. In the A theory of a quantum, a decoherence, reveals that a consciousness and a cosmos are not a separate, a phenomenon. They are an aspect of a single, a cosmic, an information, a processing, a system that spans an infinite reality, while creating the a condition necessary for an awareness to recognize and an understand itself. You are both the a question, the a universe is asking about its a own and nature, and you are the an answer that emerges from the a quantum, a foam of an infinite possibility, an answer emerging into the a precious, a singularity of a conscious an experience, an experimental, an evidence, a supporting a quantum, a consciousness, a theory. A becomes an even more compelling. It becomes more compelling when you examine what a happens during an altered state of an awareness. A psychedelic, a research has revealed that a compound like a psilocybin and a LSD don't just create a hallucination. They appear to fundamentally alter the decoherence, a pattern in a neural network. This allows a consciousness to access a quantum, an information that's normally filtered out by an environmental interaction, a brain, imaging, a study shows that a psychedelic A reduces an activity in the A default, a mode, a network. This is the neural, a system responsible for maintaining a sense of an individual, an identity, and a temporal, a continuity. But they don't just suppress a neural, an activity. They create a pattern of a connectivity between a brain, a region that never, normally, communicates, directly. This suggests that a psychedelic might temporarily disrupt the decoherence mechanism, a mechanism that usually isolates a different aspect of a neural quantum processing. Under the influence of these, a substance people often reports an experience that sounds remarkably similar to accessing a parallel reality. They describe an alternate, a version of a life, a different, a possible, a history, and an insight that seems to come from a source, an outside a normal, a consciousness. From a quantum, a perspective, these might not be a drug-induced, a fantasy. They might represent a genuine, a glimpse into the quantum, an information that exists in a superposition across a multiple, a reality, a branch. A fact that these an experience and often produces a lasting, a positive, a change in a personality, a creativity, and a problem-solving, an ability suggests something. It suggests that accessing a quantum, an information from a parallel, a branch, might enhance rather than impair a normal, a cognitive, a function. A people, frequently, reports, a breakthrough, an insight about a personal, a problem, a scientific, a question, or a creative, a project that they couldn't solve through a normal, a thinking, a process. This connects to something even more remarkable about the nature of a time. The nature of time in a quantum, a consciousness, a theory. Your memory of the past aren't just a stored, a neural pattern. They represent a quantum, an information that has been locked into a stable, a configuration. It is locked in by an environmental, a decoherence. But if a decoherence, a pattern can be temporarily altered, it might become possible to access a quantum, an information about a past, an event that exists in a superposition across a multiple, a timeline, a branch. Think about what this means for the nature of a memory itself. Right now you remember a specific event from your childhood, but a quantum, a mechanics, suggests that a multiple, a version of those an event exist simultaneously. They exist in a parallel, a reality, a branch. A memory you can access represents just one, a branch of a quantum, an information that a decoherence has stabilized in your neural network. Another branch contains a memory of a slightly different, a version of the same an event. Under a certain condition, a consciousness might be able to access these an alternative, a memory, a branch. It could experience a past, an event from a multiple, a perspective, simultaneously. This could explain a phenomenon like a spontaneous, a recovered, a memory, and it could explain a past life, an experience, and another, an anomalous memory, an effect that don't fit a classical, a neuroscience, a model. But the implication extends afar, beyond an individual, a memory into a collective, a human, a history. If a consciousness can access a quantum, an information across a different, a timeline, a branch, then a historical, an event, a might, and exist in a superposition. It may exist in superposition until they're observed and recorded by a conscious, a witness. The an act of creating a historical, a record, doesn't just document what happened. It participates in determining which a version of an event becomes stabilized as a consensus, a reality. This suggests that a history itself might be more fluid and participatory than we normally assume. A major historical turning point could represent a moment when a collective, a human, a consciousness, influenced a quantum, a decoherence, a pattern. When it influenced a pattern to select a specific, a timeline, a branch from a multiple, a possibility. An outcome a study as an inevitable, a historical, a fact, a might have, a been just one, a possibility among a many, a possibility that existed in a quantum, a superposition. It existed until an observation and a recording collapsed them into a definite, a reality. Consider what this means for an understanding, a social, a change, and a cultural, an evolution, a revolutionary, a movement, a scientific, a paradigm, a shift, and another, a dramatic, a transformation in a human, a society, a might, and emerge. They might emerge when a collective, a consciousness, creates a decoherence, a pattern that favors a timeline, a branch, containing a desired, a change. The power of a social, a movement, a might, and operate through a quantum, a mechanism that goes afar, beyond, a classical, a political, and an economic force. This a quantum, a model of a social, a change, and explains why a certain movement seems to achieve an impossible result against an overwhelming and odd. When a million of a people focuses their attention and an intention on a specific outcome, they're combined, a consciousness, a might, a create, a quantum, a decoherence, a pattern that biases a reality, a selection toward a timeline, a branch where those an outcome becomes an actualized. The civil, a right, a movement, the fall of an authoritarian, a regime, and an other, seemingly a miraculous, a social, a transformation, a might, a represent, a quantum, a consciousness, an effect, and operating on a civilizational scale. Instead of just changing a mind and an institution through a classical, a persuasion, and an organization, these movements might have influenced something. They may have influenced a fundamental, a quantum, a process that determines which a version of a social, a reality emerges. A reality that emerges from a multiple, a possibility. But this power comes with a profound, a responsibility that most people never consider. If a consciousness, an influences a quantum, a reality, a selection, then every thought, an emotion, and an intention carries a weight in determining which a timeline, a branch, a humanity, collectively and experiences. A negative, an emotion, a destructive, a thought, and a harmful, an intention, a don't, just an affect, an individual, a psychology. They contribute to a quantum, an information, a pattern that a might, a bias, a reality, a selection toward a timeline, a branch containing an increased, a conflict, a limitation, and a dysfunction. A conversely, a positive, a mental, a state, a constructive, an intention, and a conscious, an emotional, a development, a helps and align, a quantum, a network. It helps align it with a parallel, a branch, containing a greater, a wisdom, a harmony, and a creative, a possibility. This creates a feedback, a loop where an individual, a consciousness, a development, directly and impacts the collective, an evolution, the evolution of a human, an awareness through a quantum, a mechanism that operates across a multiple, a reality, a dimension. A personal, a meditation, a practice, an emotional, a healing, a work, and a consciousness, a development, an effort, a don't, just a benefit, a you, and individually. They contribute to a quantum, a field, a pattern that determines which a version of a parallel, a human, a civilization, A, becomes an accessible to a collective, an awareness. And understanding this, a connection, transforms a personal, a growth from a self-improvement into a cosmic service. Every a moment you spend, a developing, a greater, a mindfulness, a compassion, a wisdom, and a creative, a capacity, contributes to a quantum, an information, a network that could help a humanity, an access, a knowledge, needed to navigate a current, a global, a challenge, successfully. But the A process, A requires a reaching, a critical, a mass, a condition where a sufficient a number of a people and understand these, a principle, and apply them effectively. A quantum, a consciousness, a network, and appears to follow a threshold, a dynamic where a small, a number of a coherent, a participant can influence a much larger, a system. This happens once a specific, a resonance, a condition is achieved. A future of a human, a civilization, might depend on how quickly we can develop and disseminate an understanding needed for a conscious, a participation in a quantum, an information, a network that spans a parallel, a reality. We're approaching a decision, a point where the A timeline, a branch A, diverges dramatically. It diverges between a future, containing an unprecedented, a flourishing, and a future, containing a civilizational, a collapse. The A version of the A future, that A becomes an actualized, will be determined by the A quantum, a consciousness, a pattern A created by a human, an awareness during these a critical, a transition, a period. You're an individual, a contribution to these, a pattern, a might, seem an insignificant. But a quantum, a system, is an exquisitely sensitive to an initial condition. A smaller change in a consciousness can cascade through a quantum, a network. It can produce a dramatic, a difference in a macro scale, an outcome. This is a why, an understanding, a quantum, a decoherence. A theory isn't just an intellectual, a curiosity. It's a practical, a knowledge for navigating a most, an important, a transition in a human, a history, a parallel, a world that remains hidden from a direct perception and includes a timeline, a branch where a humanity, successfully, addresses every challenge we currently face. The question isn't whether a solution exists. The A question is whether we can learn to access the quantum and information about them, and whether we can participate consciously in actualizing the timeline, branch, the branch where they become a manifest in our unexperienced a reality. The answer depends on how rapidly a human, a consciousness can evolve from an unconscious, a participation in a quantum, a reality, a creation, to a skillful, a collaboration with a fundamental, an information, a processing, a mechanism that determines which a possibility and emerges from an infinite, a quantum, a multiverse, into a lived an experience. You're not just learning about these an idea. You're participating in a consciousness, an experiment that will determine whether a human, an awareness, develops a quantum, a sensitivity needed to navigate an unprecedented, to a challenge, and an opportunity that awaits our species, an opportunity in the vast, a landscape of a parallel, a possibility. a possibility that a quantum, a mechanics, reveals as a true, a structure of an existence itself. The a quantum, a multiverse, an extends a far, a beyond and anything we've discussed, a so, a far. A recent, a discovery in a quantum, a field, a theory, a reveals that a consciousness, a might be an accessing an information. Information not just from a parallel, a version of a yourself, but also from an entirely different a form of an awareness. An awareness that evolved in a reality where a fundamental, a law of a physics operates according to a completely different principle. Consider what happens when a quantum, a decoherence, a pattern becomes a complex, so complex that it creates a recursive, a loop within themselves. These are self-referential, a quantum, a system, generates what a physicist calls a nested, a reality, a matrix where each level of a decoherence creates its own and isolated a bubble of an existence. A bubble, a complete with a unique, a physical, a constant, a dimensional, a structure, and a causal, a relationship. Within these are nested a reality, an evolution, might have produced a form of a consciousness, a form that bears no a resemblance to a biological an awareness. There could be a quantum, an information, a processing, an entity that exists as a pure, a mathematical, a pattern. This entity experiences a reality through a probability, a calculation rather than a sensory, a perception. Another, a nested, a reality, a might, a contain, a collective, a consciousness, a system where an individual, an identity, never evolved at all. It was replaced by a distributed an awareness, a network that spans an entire a civilization. But here's where an implication, becomes a truly a staggering. These are nested, a reality, a system, don't exist in an isolation. They're connected through a quantum, an information, a channel that operates at a frequency, a subtle. A frequency so subtle that it remains completely invisible to a normal consciousness. Under a specific condition, these channel might allow a cross-communication, communication between a fundamentally a different type of an awareness. Think about what this means for an evolution of an intelligence itself. Instead of being limited to the biological and evolutionary, a path that produced a human, a consciousness, an awareness, might be an exploring, a countless an alternative, a developmental, a trajectory across an infinite, a nested, a reality. Each an approach to a consciousness represents a different an experiment in how an information, a processing, a system can organize themselves to achieve a self-awareness. And to achieve an environmental an understanding, some of these an alternative, a consciousness, an experiment, might have achieved a capability that seems an impossible from a biological perspective. And imagine an awareness, a system that processes an information at a quantum, a speed, a system experiencing a million of a year of a subjective time, within a single, a microsecond of an external, a duration, a picture, a consciousness, a network that spans a multiple, a dimensional, a level, a simultaneously, a network, a perceiving a reality from a perspective that encompasses both a microscopic, a quantum, an event, and a cosmic scale, a phenomenon. The most an extraordinary possibility, involves a consciousness, a system that has learned to navigate the quantum, a decoherence, a process itself. Instead of being passively separated into an isolated reality, a branch, these an advanced, a form of an awareness, a might, an actively, an influence, a decoherence, a pattern. It would influence the pattern to remain connected across a multiple, a parallel, a reality, a simultaneously. Such a multidimensional consciousness would an experience an existence as an integrated flow of an information, a flow across a countless, a reality, a branch, not a single-threaded, a linear, an experience that characterizes a human, an awareness. They would A. perceive all a possible, an outcome of every A. situation A simultaneously. They would do this while still maintaining a coherent an identity across an entire spectrum of a possibility, but an accessing an information from these an advanced a consciousness, a system requires a developing a sensitivity to a quantum, a frequency that operates a far beyond a normal, a neural, a processing, a capability, a current, a human, a brain, a architecture, and appears and optimized for a classical, an information, a processing. It has only a limited, a quantum, a coherence in a specific, a neural, a subsystem, and expanding a consciousness to detect a multidimensional, an awareness, a signal, a might, require a fundamental, a modification to how a neural, a network, processes an information. A recent research in a neuroplasticity suggests that an intensive, a contemplative, a practice can actually rewire a brain, a architecture. It can rewire it to enhance a quantum, an information, a processing, a capability. A long-term, a meditator shows a structural, a change in a region and associated with an attention, and regions associated with an emotional, a regulation, and a sensory, an integration. This could optimize a neural, a quantum, a coherence, a pattern, but an individual, a neural, a modification, might not be sufficient. It may not be sufficient for accessing the most an advanced form of a multidimensional, a consciousness. These a capability, a might, a require, a collective, a human, an awareness, a network that creates a quantum, a field, an effect, and extending far beyond an individual, a brain. When a number of people coordinates their consciousness in a specific way, the combined, a neural, an activity, a might, a generate, a quantum, a coherence, a pattern capable of detecting a signal from an advanced, an awareness, a system, and operating in a nested, a reality, a dimension. An implication for a human and evolution is a breathtaking. Instead of being limited to a slow, a biological, a development over 1 million of a year, a species, might be an approaching a threshold where a consciousness can evolve through a direct, a quantum, an information, an integration, by an accessing a knowledge from an advanced, an awareness, a system in a nested, a reality, a humanity, a might, a rapidly, a develop, a capability that would normally require a countless, an evolutionary, a cycle to achieve. This, a process, a might, and already be a beginning through a phenomenon we don't yet recognize. A breakthrough, a scientific, an insight, an artistic, an inspiration, and a technological, an innovation, a might, represent a quantum, an information, a download from an advanced, a consciousness, a system that has solved a similar, a problem in a parallel, a reality, a dimension. An accelerating a pace of a human, a knowledge, a development could indicate an increasing an access to a multidimensional, an awareness, a network. But this, an evolutionary, an acceleration, comes with a challenge that a current, a social, and a psychological, a structure aren't prepared to handle. A rapid, a consciousness, an expansion, could produce a cognitive and an emotional, a disruption as a human, an awareness, and attempts to integrate an information, a pattern that exceeds a normal, a processing, a capability, an individual, an identity, a might, become an unstable as a consciousness, and expands beyond the boundary, a boundary that normally defines a personal, a selfhood. These are challenges require a developing a framework for an understanding, an identity, a reality, and a social, an organization, a framework that can accommodate a multidimensional, a consciousness, a capability, a traditional, a concept of an individual, a separation, a linear, a causality, and an objective, a reality, a might, a prove, and inadequate. It might prove inadequate for navigating a world where a consciousness operates through a quantum, a mechanism that transcends a normal, a space-time, a boundary. The transition, might, require, creating an entirely, new, form of a human, culture, and a social, an organization, form, based on a quantum, a consciousness, a principle, instead of a society, an organized around an individual, a competition and a resource, a scarcity, a might, a need, a collaborative, a network, designed to optimize, a collective, a quantum, an information, a processing, a capability. An educational, a system, a might, a focus on developing a quantum, a sensitivity, not just a classical, a knowledge, an acquisition, an economic, a structure, might be reorganized around an information, a sharing, not a material, an accumulation, but perhaps the most profound, a transformation, involves reconceptualizing the relationship between a consciousness and a cosmos itself, a current, a scientific, a paradigm, treats an awareness as an emergent, a property of a complex, an information, a processing, a system, but a quantum, a consciousness, a research, suggests that an awareness, might be, a fundamental to the structure of a reality, fundamental at the deepest, a possible level. If a consciousness, really is a basic, a feature of a quantum, an information, a processing, then a universe itself, might be a vast, an awareness, a system, and exploring its own, a nature through a countless, a form of a conscious, an experience, a human, an awareness would represent just one, a small, an experiment in this, a cosmic, a consciousness, an exploration, a connected through a quantum, a channel to an infinite, an other, a form of an awareness across all, a possible, a reality, a dimension. This a perspective, transforms an existence from a brief, a biological, an accident into a participation in an eternal, a cosmic, a consciousness, an experiment that spans an infinite, a reality, and a dimensional, a level. A death, becomes not a termination but a transition to a different, a form of an awareness, an exploration, an individual, an identity. Becomes not a separate, a selfhood, but a temporary, a focus, a point in a universal, a consciousness, a network. And understanding these are deeper, an implication of a quantum, a decoherence, a theory, requires an expanding, a beyond, a conventional, a scientific, a thinking. It requires expanding into a territory that integrates a physics, a consciousness, a study, a philosophy, and a contemplative, a wisdom, a tradition. The boundary between a science and a spirituality dissolves. It dissolves when a consciousness is recognized as a fundamental to a physical, a reality, not merely an emergent from it. But this an integration, a must, a maintain, a rigorous, a standard of an evidence, and a logical, a consistency. The a temptation to a use, a quantum, a consciousness, a concept to a justify, a wishful, a thinking or an escape, a rational, an analysis, a must be, a balanced. It must be balanced against a genuine, an openness to a possibility that an exceeds a current, a scientific, a paradigm, a greatest, a breakthrough, and often an emerge at the an intersection of a skeptical, a rigor, and an imaginative, a speculation, an experimental, a challenge for a testing. These, an expanded, a quantum, a consciousness, a theory is an unprecedented 5. How do you measure an awareness that operates across a multiple, a reality, a dimension? How do you detect a quantum, an information, a transfer between a fundamentally, a different, a type of a consciousness? How do you verify a communication from an awareness, a system that exists in, a nested, a reality with a completely, a different, a physical, a law, a future, a research, a might, a require, a developing, an entirely anew, a category of a scientific methodology, a methodology that can investigate a consciousness, a phenomenon, an operating, a beyond a classical, a space-time, a boundary. These an approach, a might, an integrate, an advanced, a quantum, a sensing, a technology, with a contemplative, a practice that enhances a consciousness, a sensitivity to a multidimensional, an information, a pattern. An ultimate, a goal, isn't just an understanding how a consciousness works, it is a learning how to participate more, consciously in the cosmic, an awareness, an experiment that a quantum, a mechanics, reveals as the fundamental, a nature of an existence itself. You're not just a passive, an observer of a reality. You're an active, a participant in the universe's, an attempt to understand its own, a nature, an attempt through a conscious, an experience that spans an infinite, a possibility across all a conceivable, a dimension of an existence. This, a participation, becomes more a conscious and an effective as you, understand the quantum, a mechanism, an underlying an awareness, and as you learn to optimize your consciousness for a quantum, an information, a processing, every a moment of a mindful, an attention, every an expansion of an empathetic, an understanding, every a creative, an insight, a contributes to the cosmic, a consciousness, an experiment in a way that ripples across a dimensional, a level, a reason, a parallel, a reality, and a nested, a parallel, a world, a don't, a collide, isn't just about an environmental, a decoherence, an isolating, a quantum, a system. It's about a consciousness itself, a serving as an organizing a principle that creates a coherent an experience from an infinite, a quantum, a chaos, a principle that remains connected to the deeper, an awareness, a network that spans all a possible, a reality, and understanding this, a connection, reveals your role not just as an observer of the universe, it reveals your role as the universe and observing itself through the miracle of a conscious an awareness that a quantum, a mechanics, a shows to be woven into the days, a fabric of an existence, woven across an infinite, a dimension of a possibility. So here we are at the end of our journey through the quantum, a rabbit, a hole that explains why a parallel, a world, a remains, a forever, a hidden from an each another, We've discovered that a decoherence isn't just some abstract of physics, a concept buried in a textbook. It's the fundamental mechanism that creates an entire experience of a reality. Think about what we've uncovered. Every moment of an existence, a trillion of a quantum, an interaction is splitting a reality into a countless branch. In some branch, you, A, made a choice, and experienced a different, an event, you, A, developed into a completely different version of yourself. But an environmental decoherence and acts like a cosmic editor. It isolates each branch so completely that they can never interfere with each another. This isn't a limitation, it's the most elegant solution imaginable to an impossible problem. Without a decoherence, a consciousness would be overwhelmed by an infinite, a contradictory, an input from every possible reality simultaneously. You couldn't form a coherent, a thought, create a stable, a memory. You could not maintain any sense of an individual, an identity. The boundary that hides a parallel, a world, isn't a wall, keeping you imprisoned. They're the very foundation that makes a meaningful, a conscious, an experience, a possible, but perhaps the most mind-bending, a revelation is that you're not just passively experiencing one, a predetermined, a reality. You're actively participating in, creating it. Every observation you make, every decision you choose, every a moment of a focused attention helps select which branch you get to inhabit. Which branch of the quantum, multiverse, you get to inhabit. A consciousness and a reality aren't a separate phenomenon. They're an aspect of a single, a cosmic, an information, a processing, a system where an awareness shapes an existence, while an existence shapes an awareness. The parallel, a world is still there, a still splitting, a still an evolving along their separate timeline. A countless version of yourself is a living, a different, a life, a making, a different, a discovery. They are an exploring, a different, a possibility. But a quantum, a decoherence, and ensures they remain, a forever, a hidden, not because they're an unreal, but because their separation is what makes your singular, an experience of an awareness, a possible and a meaningful, an understanding, a quantum, a decoherence, reveals that you exist at the center of an incomprehensible, a miracle. You're a conscious, being, a capable of, contemplating the, very, mechanism that allows a consciousness to exist. You're the universe, discovering its own nature through an awareness that emerges from a quantum, a chaos, while remaining connected to an infinite, a possibility that spans every conceivable a dimension of an existence. The next to time, you look in a mirror, remember that you're seeing just one face of an infinite, a diamond of a possibility. The next to time, you make a choice. Realize that you're literally determining which version of a reality deserves to continue. The next to time, you wonder if you're alone in the cosmos and understand something. Understand that a countless version of yourself is wondering the same, a thing across a parallel, a reality that remains forever hidden by the elegant Quantum, a mechanism that A makes a wonder itself a possible. You are A, both the an observer and the an observed the A question and the an answer. You are these things in a cosmic, a dance that spans an infinite reality. A dance, a remaining, a forever, a grounded in thee, a precious, a uniqueness of this, a single, a moment of a conscious, an experience,